Top one, scaphism. Scaphism. You are being fed milk and honey, not as a kindness. A Persian soldier holds your head back and pours until you vomit. And then he pours more. He smears the rest across your face, your hands, your feet, every surface of skin that the sun can find. Then they fold you between two hollowed wooden boats, a matching pair. Your head and hands and feet poking out through holes cut at the edges. They nail the planks together. They push you out onto a stagnant marsh pond. You are not in the dark. That would be mercy. You are in full, open, Persian sunlight. The insects arrive within the hour. This is scaphism. And the reason you have probably never heard of it in a history class is not because the sources are weak. It is because the civilization that used it decided at some administrative level to pretend it did not exist. The method is described in near-clinical detail by the Greek historian Plutarch in his Life of Artaxerxes, written around 100 CE, drawing from an earlier account by Ctesias of Cnidus, a Greek physician who served at the Persian royal court from approximately 415 to 398 BCE. Ctesias was not a tourist. He was the king's personal doctor. He claimed to have had direct access to the court records and the courtiers who witnessed what happened to a man named Mithridates, a Persian soldier who had the misfortune of killing Cyrus the Younger at the Battle of Cunaxa in 401 BCE. Cyrus was the king's brother. That distinction mattered enormously. According to Ctesias, Mithridates survived the scaphism for 17 days before dying. The biological sequence he describes moves from fly infestation to larval colonization of the living flesh, to gangrene, to systemic organ failure. It is not the account of a man embellishing a rumor. It reads like a medical report. In 2016, entomologist Dr. Piers Mitchell of Cambridge University examined the description in the context of ancient execution methods and confirmed the biological sequence is medically accurate. The progression Ctesias recorded matches precisely what modern forensic entomology would predict. This was a real process described by a real eyewitness, verified by modern science 2,500 years later. And yet, across the entire surviving archive of Achaemenid Persian administrative records, including the Persepolis fortification tablets, over 30,000 clay documents excavated by the Oriental Institute of Chicago beginning in 1933 that catalog grain rations, worker wages, temple allocations, and royal travel itineraries. There is not a single reference to scaphism, not an authorization, not a sentencing record, not even an oblique administrative euphemism. An empire meticulous enough to record the daily bread allocation of 1,000 workers left zero trace of its most notorious execution. The historian Valerius Maximus, writing around 30 CE, describes scaphism as a punishment so extreme it was considered outside normal Persian law, a tool of royal personal vengeance rather than the judicial system. That is one explanation for the archival silence. It was personal, not institutional, so it was never filed. But that explanation requires us to accept something uncomfortable. That a Greek physician with direct court access fabricated a method so biologically precise that modern forensic science validates every stage of it, then attributed it to a real name victim at a historically verified battle, and that 3 independent ancient authors corroborated it, and that the Persians simply happened to leave no trace of it in an archive that recorded nearly everything else. Some researchers ask a different question. Was the absence from Persian records not an oversight, but a policy? The scaphism left no intact body. It produced no legal precedent. It existed in the space between justice and revenge, which is exactly where the most powerful punishments have always lived. And if that space was deliberately kept off the books, we have to ask, what else was happening out on that water? Who else was pushed out onto a pond and simply never mentioned? We may never know. The marsh has been dry for 2,000 years. The record was never made. Top 2. The Assyrian flaying ritual from Persia. We moved to a civilization that took the opposite approach. They carved the evidence directly into stone, 8 ft tall, in the most public room of the palace. And then they removed exactly one tablet that explained what the carvings meant, the Assyrian flaying ritual. You can see it right now. You do not need a research permit or a museum after hours pass. Walk into the British Museum in London, find room 7, and stand in front of the wall panels from the Northwest Palace at Nimrud. They have been there since 1851 when archaeologist Austin Henry Layard shipped them from northern Iraq. The carvings are 8 ft tall and extraordinarily precise. Soldiers holding human skins stretched wide like cloaks displayed for inspection. Skins nailed to city walls in long rows like banners after a parade. A man being flayed alive in the center of a composition, while a scribe, standing calm beside him, takes notes. Someone was counting. Someone was keeping a record. That specific record has never been found. The palace at Nimrud, ancient Kalhu, was built by the Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal II, who ruled from 883 to 859 BCE. His own annals, preserved on a stone prism, now also in the British Museum, include explicit descriptions of flaying enemy leaders after military victories. This is not disputed. Assyrian scholarship accepts the flaying panels as propaganda imagery, the state broadcasting its capacity for extreme violence to every foreign dignitary who walked through the throne room. The reliefs were the message. That is the mainstream explanation, and it is reasonable. But then there is tablet K188. Cuneiform specialist Irving Finkel of the British Museum identified this small tablet, approximately 7 centimeters by 5 centimeters, in the Kuyunjik collection, which contains tens of thousands of tablets recovered from the Great Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. The tablet is written not in standard administrative cuneiform, but in a priestly dialect, the kind used in temple archives rather than palace records. And according to Finkel, it appears to describe the ceremonial protocol of a flaying execution with specific priestly roles, a prescribed sequence of incisions, and a theological purpose connected to the Assyrian god Ninurta, deity of war, the hunt, and sacred order. This is not a military account. It is operational liturgy. If this was a standard priestly ceremony practiced across the empire over the 2 centuries of Assyrian imperial dominance, there should be dozens of parallel texts. Temple archives were exhaustive. Priestly procedures were documented with the same obsessive bureaucratic detail that characterized everything else in Assyrian administration. The Assyrian dictionary, compiled by the Oriental Institute of Chicago, lists the Akkadian verb meaning to flay with 14 documented usages in royal annals and 0 usages in any legal, priestly, or administrative text. Not reduced, not rare, 0. The asymmetry, according to cuneiform scholars, is highly anomalous. The Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh contained an estimated 30,000 tablets when it burned in 612 BCE during the sack of Nineveh by the Babylonians and Medes. Historian Karen Radner of University College London has argued that the destruction of certain archive rooms was so total it appears targeted rather than random, the result of fire concentrated in specific sections of the library complex. K1688 may be the sole surviving fragment of an entire ritual tradition, a single ember from a deliberately extinguished fire. What makes this strange in a different way than the Persian case is the visual evidence sitting in plain sight in London. The reliefs show the act. They are enormous, detailed, and were clearly intended to be seen. But showing the act is different from explaining it. A soldier holding a stretched human skin, and a scribe beside a man being flayed while counting, and a theological protocol that link the procedure to divine order. Those are 3 different layers of the same practice. The propaganda layer survived. The administrative layer vanished. The liturgical layer exists in one orphan tablet with no parallel. Sennacherib, who ruled a century after Ashurnasirpal, describes flaying in his annals but uses distinctly passive language. The skins were removed, rather than the active first-person boasting of his predecessor. Something shifted in how the Assyrian state chose to talk about this. And then, when the library burned, the layer that would have told us what it meant went with it. We have the pictures, we have one fragment of the manual, and we have the shape of something that was practiced for centuries by the most powerful empire in the ancient Near East, and then became almost completely a secret even from itself. Top 3, the Mayan Sinote Oracle, Execution. From the carved walls of Mesopotamia, we crossed 2 oceans to a sacred waterhole in the jungle of the Yucatan, where the execution was not always the end. For some who entered the water, It was apparently the beginning of something the Spanish colonial church found far more threatening than death: the Mayan cenote oracle execution. Imagine being thrown into darkness from a height of 27 meter. Not a cave, not a cell, but a hole in the limestone earth 60 meter across, dropping straight down to black water that has no visible bottom from above. The fall takes long enough to think. Then the water takes you. Now imagine that some of you were supposed to come back up. That is the part of this story that disappeared. The sacred cenote at Chichen Itza in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico is one of the most excavated ritual sites in the Western Hemisphere. Edward Herbert Thompson of the Carnegie Institution of Washington dredged it between 1904 and 1911, recovering over 30,000 artifacts, jade ornaments, gold discs, copal incense, obsidian blades, and the skeletal remains of at least 42 individuals, spanning every demographic from infants to mature adults. The cenote's role as a site of sacrificial offering to the rain deity Chak is thoroughly documented and widely accepted. That part is not the mystery. The mystery is a single passage in a document written by the man who burned almost every other document about Mayan religion that existed. Bishop Diego de Landa's Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, written around 1566, is the primary Spanish colonial account of pre-contact Mayan practice. It is also the same document in which de Landa describes his own auto de fe at Mani on July 12, 1562. The event at which he burned what he recorded as 27 books of hieroglyphics and subjected approximately 1,400 Mayan individuals to inquisitorial torture. The Inquisition records from that event, known as the Proceso contra los Indios de Mani, survive. Historian Inga Clendinnen of the Universidad Autónoma de Yucatán called it the most thorough. De Landa's account of the cenote includes a brief passage that most scholars have treated as a minor detail, but which, read carefully, describes something with very different implications than straightforward sacrifice. He writes that individuals were thrown into the cenote at dawn as offerings, and that those who had not died by midday were pulled back to the surface by ropes, half dead, warmed by fires, and then questioned about what they had experienced below. Questioned for divine messages, interrogated as oracles who had passed through death and returned. A 2015 reanalysis of the cenote skeletal material by physical anthropologists Vera Teisler and Andrea Cucina at the Universidad Autónoma de Yucatán, using isotopic analysis of bone chemistry, found that the recovered individuals divided into two distinct populations. One group showed the dietary and physiological signatures of prolonged captivity and malnutrition. The other group showed the bone chemistry of elite individuals, people who had eaten well throughout their lives. Two different kinds of people in the same sacred deposit. That division is not explained by a single type of offering to a rain god. Of the potentially hundreds of Maya books existing before 1562, 4 codices survived: the Dresden, the Madrid, the Paris, and the disputed Grolier. Mayan epigrapher David Stewart of the University of Texas has noted that the absence of any direct description of cenote ritual protocol across all 4 surviving codices is structurally suspicious, given the centrality of Chichen Itza to the post-classic world. The Spanish colonial records from the Relaciones Geográficas de Yucatán, compiled between 1579 and 1581, describe cenote sacrifice only in the past tense and only as throwing. The oracle recovery element that de Landa himself described in 1566 is gone from the record within a single generation. De Landa was not reconstructing folklore. He was describing a practice he was actively suppressing. He had tortured its practitioners to extract confessions about it. He is the most unreliable narrator imaginable and simultaneously the most informed witness we have. Some researchers ask whether the oracle dimension of the cenote was the specific element the colonial church found most threatening. Not the killing, which could be reframed as barbarism, but the claim that death could be survived, and that what was found on the other side carried information. That idea was not compatible with Christian theology, and unlike bones, which stay at the bottom of a waterhole, ideas could be burned. 3 surviving codices, no oracle protocol, 1 passage in the book written by the man who lit the fire. Top 4. The Carthaginian Tophet. In the Yucatan, the church burned the books. In North Africa, Rome burned the city. But before Rome razed Carthage to its foundations in 146 BCE, it spent 2 generations telling the world that what happened inside those walls was too monstrous to be believed. The archaeology has recently started to tell a different story. The Carthaginian Tophet. The Romans said Carthage burned its children alive. They described a bronze idol, hollow and heated from beneath, arms extended to receive infant offerings dropped into its burning stomach, while priests beat drums to drown out the screaming. For 2,000 years, this account shaped everything we believed about Carthaginian civilization. It was used to justify conquest, to frame Rome as the civilized power defeating barbarism. And then, archaeologists began reading the bones more carefully. The Tophet of Salambo is the largest ancient ritual deposit site in the Mediterranean world. It sits in what is now central Tunis, Tunisia, covering approximately 6,000 square meters and contains thousands of burial urns spanning roughly 600 years of Carthaginian history, from the 8th to the 2nd century BCE. Excavations began in 1921 under Francis Kelsey of the University of Michigan and have continued with French and Tunisian teams since. For most of the 20th century, the site was accepted as physical confirmation of Roman accounts. Urns containing cremated remains of infants and children dedicated to the gods Baal, Hammon, and Tanit. The Romans were right. Then in 2010, a team led by Jeffrey Schwartz of the University of Pittsburgh and Frank Houghton published a skeletal analysis in the journal PLOS One. They examined 540 individual samples from the Tophet. Approximately 20% of them were not infants. They were adults. Some of those adult remains showed perimortem trauma, injury at or around the time of death, consistent with violent execution rather than natural causes or ritual cremation of someone who had already died. The Roman accounts mentioned only infants. Every Greek account mentioned only infants. Not a single ancient source describes adults in the Tophet, and yet they are there. Isotopic analysis by historian Josephine Quinn of the University of Oxford confirmed that the deposit patterns across the site are inconsistent with what you would expect from natural infant mortality rates. When populations bury their children who die of natural causes, the patterns look different. The Tophet looks like deliberate structured deposition over centuries. Something was being decided about who went in. Zooarchaeological analysis of the urns found that approximately 30% of deposits contained only animal bones, suggesting the ritual had a substitution protocol built into it, that under certain circumstances, an animal could stand in for a human offering. A practice with substitution logic is a practice with a defined hierarchy of who qualifies and under what conditions. Richard Miles of the University of Cambridge, writing in his 2010 History of Carthage, argues that the baby burning narrative was deliberately amplified by Roman propaganda during the Punic Wars to provide moral justification for the campaign to destroy Carthage entirely. Cato, the elder's famous repeated demand that Carthage must be destroyed, was itself part of a documented rhetorical strategy. And the total destruction of Carthage by Scipio Aemilianus in 146 BCE was so complete, the city razed, its population killed or enslaved, its libraries burned, that Carthaginian records were effectively eliminated from history. What we have left is what Rome chose to preserve, which is to say, what Rome chose to tell us about a civilization it had just erased. But here is what Rome did not account for. The bones stayed, and the bones are saying something that does not fit the story Rome told. Some researchers ask whether the Tophet was a judicial ritual space where the most extreme state punishments, reserved for enemies of the city, traitors, and prisoners of war, were administered alongside infant votive offerings. Whether what Rome described as evidence of savagery was actually a functioning legal and religious system that Rome found uncomfortably sophisticated, whether the reason the baby burning narrative was so consistent across Roman sources is precisely because the adult execution dimension was the element Rome had the most political interest in suppressing. You cannot claim to be liberating a people from barbarism if the evidence suggests their institutional practices were more complex than your own propaganda allows. The Tophet is still being excavated. The bones keep accumulating, and the story keeps changing. Top 5. The Blood Eagle Carthage's secret was buried under 2,000 years of rubble. The Norse secret was buried under something harder to excavate, the question of whether it was real at all. The Blood Eagle. The sagas say the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok stood over the captured king of Northumbria and opened him like a text they needed to read. They cut along the spine. They broke the ribs outward from the back one by one until they spread wide and flat like the wings of a bird. They reached inside while he was still breathing and pulled out the lungs, draping them across his shoulders. The sagas call it the Blood Eagle. 9 centuries of scholarship have argued about whether it ever happened. No skeleton with the corresponding injuries has ever been found. That absence is either proof the practice was fiction or proof it was specifically designed to leave no evidence. The earliest surviving reference is a skaldic verse attributed to the poet Sigvaldur Thordarson, written around 1038 CE, which uses the term blood eagle in a way that presupposes the audience already knows exactly what it refers to. That is not how you introduce a concept. That is how you invoke one. The method is described across 4 independent Old Norse sources spanning 2 centuries. The verse attributed to Sigvaldur, the Orkneyinga saga, the Ragnar saga Lodbrokar, and Snorri Sturluson's Skaldskaparmal, written around 1220 CE. The victim in the earliest account is Ella, king of Northumbria, whose death is placed at approximately 867 CE during the Danish Great Heathen Army's campaign through England. In 2019, forensic pathologist Robert Reed and medical historian Luke John Murphy co-authored a study in Speculum, the Journal of Medieval Studies, examining whether the blood eagle was anatomically executable. Their conclusion was that it was. The procedure as described would require knowledge consistent with butchery practice rather than formal medical training, specifically the experience that came from dressing large animal carcasses. A skilled practitioner could break the posterior ribs outward and expose the lungs while the subject survived long enough for the act to have the ceremonial weight the sagas describe. The procedure is not physically impossible. That finding matters because one of the main scholarly arguments against the blood eagle has always been that the human body simply could not tolerate it. It can. Now here is the impossibility. The killing of King Ella by Viking forces during the conquest of Northumbria in 867 CE is one of the most significant events documented in the opening phase of the Danish occupation of England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the primary English record of this period, documents the Viking campaigns in Northumbria in considerable detail. It records the fall of York. It records the death of Ella, but it describes his fate only as having been killed. No method, no context, no description of what was done to the king of Northumbria by the men who conquered his kingdom. The most sensational act of the entire invasion is simply absent from the account of the invaded. Historian Neil Price of Uppsala University, writing in The Viking Way, argues that Norse conversion to Christianity, beginning in the late 10th century, involved systematic rewriting of pagan ritual by Christian scribes. The most theologically compromising pre-Christian practices were either suppressed, transformed into legend, or reframed as barbaric anomaly to smooth the conversion narrative. The blood eagle, if it was a genuine sacrifice to Odin, would have been precisely the kind of ritual that Christian Norse scribes had every institutional reason to obscure, and Anglo-Saxon Christian chroniclers, writing for an ecclesiastical audience, had every political reason to decline to record the full ceremonial details of their king's ritual humiliation at pagan hands. 2 independent record-keeping systems, one Norse and one English, both suppress the same event in the same generation. That is not coincidence. That is 2 institutions making the same editorial decision for different reasons. Some researchers ask whether the blood eagle's complete absence from the archaeological record, no skeletal remains with posterior rib trauma of the relevant kind have been identified in Viking Age Europe, is simply a function of where such a ritual would have been performed and how those sites were later treated. Sacred execution grounds are not the locations archaeologists typically excavate first, and you cannot find what no one looked for at the right address. Top 6. The Brazen Bull of Piraeus. From Scandinavia, we move to Sicily, where a man designed the most acoustically sophisticated execution machine in the ancient world, was the first person to die in it, and left no entry in the legal code of the civilization that used it for a century afterward. The brazen bull of Piraeus. Every source agrees on the detail that should bother you most. The man who designed it was the first person to die in it, not as punishment for a crime, as a demonstration. The tyrant who commissioned the device decided that after Piraeus of Athens had finished explaining how it worked, the most efficient way to test the acoustic calibration was to lock the inventor inside. This is the part that every ancient account confirms, and it is the part that tells you exactly what kind of institution you are dealing with. Piraeus built a hollow bronze bull, life-size, with a door fitted into its side large enough to admit a human being, and a system of pipes running from the interior cavity to the animal's nostrils. The condemned were locked inside. A fire was lit beneath the bronze, and the acoustic design of the pipes transformed the screams of the person inside through the physics of the metal and the geometry of the passages into a sound that the audience outside heard as the bellowing of a bull. The killing was invisible. The sound was theater. The device was commissioned by the tyrant Phalaris of Acragas, the city we now call Agrigento on the southern coast of Sicily, who ruled from approximately 570 to 554 BCE. This is not a single-source myth. Pindar references the device in his first Pythian ode, written around 470 BCE, within living memory of the device's alleged operation. Diodorus Siculus describes it in his Library of History. Lucian of Samosata provides the most technically detailed account, specifying the pipe system and the acoustic transformation, writing around 160 CE, but drawing from earlier sources. Ovid mentions it in the Ars Amatoria. 4 independent ancient authors across 600 years of classical literature, none of them connected by a shared source for this specific detail, all describe the same machine. In 2007, acoustic engineer Professor Nico de Klerk and colleague Cindy de Keyser published a study in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America, modeling the acoustic principles described in the ancient accounts. Their conclusion was that the transformation of human screams into lower frequency sound resembling animal vocalization is physically achievable within the parameters of ancient bronze casting and pipe fitting technology. The device could have been built, it could have functioned exactly as described. The engineering is not the mystery. The mystery is the legal silence. Phalaris ruled Acragas for approximately 16 years. The brazen bull was supposedly used throughout his reign. His city produced inscriptions, administrative documents, and coinage. Several of his inscriptions survive. None of them references execution methods of any kind. When Phalaris was overturned, the democratic government that replaced him, following standard Greek practice, issued formal condemnations of his tyrannical acts, the kind of civic accounting that is precisely how we know so much about what Athenian tyrants did wrong. In Acragas after Phalaris, there is no such accounting. His methods are documented only by outsiders writing about a city whose internal record chose silence. Historian Robin Osborne of Cambridge University has noted that Greek tyrants of the archaic period systematically avoided documenting punishments in public inscriptions to prevent successors from citing them as legal precedent. Extrajudicial killing that happened outside the formal court system, was kept off the books by design. The device was real. The design was brilliant. But brilliance in a tyrant's arsenal is not something that gets filed. Diodorus Siculus records that when Carthaginian forces sacked Acragas in 406 BCE, the brazen bull was taken as a trophy, which means it went to Carthage. Which means in 146 BCE, when Rome destroyed Carthage completely, the most famous execution device in the Greek world was almost certainly destroyed in the same fire that consumed the Carthaginian libraries. Some researchers ask whether the specific acoustic detail of the brazen bull, the transformation of screaming into bellowing, was not incidental engineering, but the theological point of the entire mechanism. If the audience could not hear a human being dying, could only hear what sounded like a bull in distress, what exactly was the state authorizing? And why was a device capable of making killing acoustically invisible so carefully kept out of the written law of every civilization that knew about it? Top 7, the Roman Vestal Immurement. From Sicily, we go underground, literally. There is a sealed room beneath central Rome that has not been opened in nearly 2,000 years. The women who were sent into it were never rehabilitated, and the legal records of their trials were removed from the senatorial archive within a generation of their deaths. The Roman Vestal Immurement. She was not killed. The law was very clear about that. No Vestal virgin's blood could be spilled. The Romans had constructed over centuries a theological and legal architecture that made direct execution of a Vestal impossible, while still finding ways to kill them. The solution they arrived at was precise and deeply strange. A small underground room was prepared near the Colline Gate of Rome, in the area known as the Campus Celeratus, the Field of the Wicked. The room contained a narrow bed, an oil lamp, a jug of water, a jug of milk, a small amount of bread. The condemned Vestal descended into it by ladder. The entrance was filled with earth and packed tight. Rome walked away. What happened next was between the Vestal and whatever she found in the dark. The practice is documented by Livy, Plutarch, Pliny the Elder, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and Suetonius. It was used by most estimates on approximately 18 Vestals across the roughly 900 years of the Roman Republic and Empire, though only 6 are named in surviving sources. The other 12 are referenced obliquely, their trials invisible, their fates confirmed only by the gaps where their records should be. Of the named cases, the most documented is Cornelia, the chief Vestal of Rome, executed on the orders of Emperor Domitian at some point between 83 and 91 CE, depending on which modern historian you consult. Pliny the Younger, who was an adult in Rome during this period, describes Cornelia's descent into the chamber in his letters with the specificity of a man describing something that happened within his living memory. He records her words as she stepped onto the ladder. He describes the legal atmosphere surrounding Domitian's decision in terms that make clear he and his contemporaries regarded the charges against Cornelia as fabricated. Suetonius, also writing within living memory of the events, states plainly that Domitian had 4 Vestals executed, the 3 convicted under previous emperors, and Cornelia herself, and that in Cornelia's case the evidence was, to put it gently, convenient. Here is the administrative impossibility. The immurement of a Vestal virgin was not a casual act of tyranny. It required a formal legal process, accusation, investigation by the Pontifex Maximus, trial before the full College of Pontiffs, sentencing. It was Roman religious law at its most elaborate. That process generated paperwork. Yet the Acta Senatus, the Senate proceedings from Domitian's reign, which survive in fragments cited by later authors, contain no record of Vestal trials. The Vestal record itself, the institutional register maintained by the College of Pontiffs containing the names, terms of service, and fates of every Vestal from the founding of the office, has never been found. A document tracking 9 centuries of Rome's most sacred religious institution simply does not exist. Domitian's successor, Nerva, undertook a formal legal review of Domitian's most egregious judicial acts as part of what Roman sources call the restoration of liberty. Other categories of Domitian's victims received posthumous rehabilitation. Their honors were restored. Their condemnations were formally reversed. The executed Vestals received nothing. Their names were not rehabilitated. Their records were not recovered. Every other class of Domitian's judicial victims was addressed. The Vestals were left exactly where Domitian had put them, which is to say, underground and off the books. The Campus Celeratus has been identified by ancient topographers near the Colline Gate on the Via Nomentana, in an area now occupied by the infrastructure of the Stazione Termini complex in central Rome. The site has never been systematically excavated. It is not a question of not knowing where to look. It is a question of what a full excavation might find, and whether the political and institutional will to conduct one has ever actually materialized. A sealed room that was constructed to hold a human being, built to Roman engineering standards, somewhere beneath the eastern edge of central Rome, and the unspoken consensus appears to be that it should stay sealed. Some researchers ask whether the failure to rehabilitate Domitian's Vestals was not an oversight in Nerva's otherwise thorough review, but a specific decision. Whether there was a calculation that reopening the question of women who had been executed for sexual impurity, regardless of whether the charges were true, served no political purpose for any subsequent government. Whether the missing legal record was not lost, but left missing. The room is still there. The record is still gone. And the combination of those two facts is, in its quiet way, its own kind of answer. Top 8. The Aztec Tlaxcala. Pewali Stli. From a sealed room under Rome, we travel to a manuscript that spent 250 years in a cardinal's private library in a small town south of Rome, unseen by scholars. Its contents quietly quarantined from the academic world. It may be the most complete surviving record of what the Spanish colonial church tried hardest to erase, the Aztec Tlaxcala Pewali Stli. For roughly 300 years, the most intact pre-Columbian ritual manuscript in existence sat in a cardinal's bedroom. Not a library in the formal institutional sense, a private collection belonging to Cardinal Stefano Borgia of Velletri, who acquired it sometime in the 18th century by means that remain undocumented. The cardinal knew what he had. He corresponded with early Americanist scholars. He showed it to select visitors. He did not make it generally available for study. When he died in 1804, the manuscript passed to the Vatican Apostolic Library, where it was catalogued as Codex Borgianus Mexicanus I and remained under restricted access for nearly another 2 centuries. Full high-resolution digitization was completed only in 2012. What the cardinal had in his bedroom was a pre-Columbian Aztec screenfold book made of deer skin, approximately 4 mm long when fully extended, containing 76 pages of painted ritual content with no European iconographic elements of any kind. Its origin predates the Spanish conquest. It is one of 4 surviving pre-Columbian screenfold books, and it contains what researchers believe is an encrypted version of the Tlaxcala Pewali Stli ceremony, the Flaying of Men festival, encoded in a visual language that the colonial church spent decades trying to eliminate from the earth. To understand why this matters, you need the scale of what was destroyed. When Hernán Cortés completed the conquest of Tenochtitlan in 1521, the systematic elimination of Aztec pictorial manuscripts began almost immediately. Bishop Juan de Zumárraga burned a documented collection of Aztec manuscripts and codices in the marketplace of Texcoco in 1530. Diego de Landa's burning of Maya texts in 1562, catastrophic as it was one episode in a decades-long continental campaign. Historian Francis Cartunen has estimated that over 90% of Aztec pictorial manuscripts were destroyed between 1521 and 1600. Of the handful that survived, several did so because they were already in Europe, removed from Mexico in the early colonial period, by routes that in most cases cannot be fully reconstructed. The Spanish colonial accounts of Tlaxcala Pewali Stli that do survive primarily in Fray Bernardino de Sahagun's Florentine Codex, completed in 1577, and Diego Duran's Book of the Gods and Rites, written around 1574, were produced by Spanish priests working from the testimony of Nahua informants in the decades after the conquest. They are already filtered. They describe a festival spanning 20 days associated with Siptotec, the deity of agricultural renewal and seasonal transformation, in which sacrificial victims were flayed, and priests wore the skins for a ritual period representing the earth's new skin emerging beneath the old. The theology is documented. The general sequence is documented. The detailed anatomical protocol, the specific knowledge required to produce a complete intact skin from a living person in a way that preserved its ceremonial utility, is not. Art historian Elizabeth Hill Boone of Tulane University has identified a specific sequence of pages in the Codex Borgia that she associates with the Siptotec ritual, noting that the visual arrangement follows a logic distinct from the surrounding mythological sections. It reads as procedural rather than narrative. Forensic osteoarchaeologist Ximena Chavez Balderas of the Templo Mayor project at UNAM analyzed skeletal remains from the Great Temple excavations in Mexico City and found individuals showing perimortem cut marks consistent with systematic posterior skinning, beginning at the extremities and moving to the torso. That sequence matches the visual logic of the Codex Borgia pages. The Vatican Library holds the manuscript that may contain the pre-contact version of that protocol. The access restrictions are easing. The scholarship is accumulating. But the 250-year gap between the Codex arriving in a cardinal's private collection and being made fully available for academic examination is its own kind of document. Someone decided repeatedly across multiple generations that what the Codex Borgia contained was not something that needed to be widely read. Some researchers ask not just what the Codex shows, but why the church recognized it as dangerous enough to quarantine rather than destroy. Burning was always an option. They had used it before and would use it again. The Codex was kept, and the question of what exactly they were choosing to preserve and from whom has not yet been fully answered. Top 9. The Spartan Cryptia. From the Vatican's private collection, we travel to a civilization that solved the problem of institutional documentation in a completely different way. Not by hiding the records, not by burning them, by never making them in the first place. The Spartan Cryptia. Every autumn, Sparta declared war on its own people, not an external enemy, its own enslaved population, the Helots, who outnumbered Spartan citizens by a ratio that ancient sources suggest was as high as 7-1. The state formally announced a state of war, which meant under Greek legal convention that any killing that followed carried no legal consequence. It was not murder, it was warfare. And then young Spartan men were sent out into the countryside alone, armed with nothing but a short knife, with orders to move by night and kill any Helot they encountered. This was the Cryptia. It was not a secret operation. It was the curriculum. It was what the Spartan state did to produce Spartan soldiers. And there is not a single document produced by Sparta that describes how it worked. The Cryptia is confirmed by 3 independent ancient sources of the highest credibility. Thucydides, writing in the late 5th century BCE within 2 generations of events he describes, records in Book 4 of his History of the Peloponnesian War the disappearance of 2,000 Helots during the war period of approximately 424 BCE. They were selected for apparent military valor, honored in formal procession around the temples, declared free, and then, in Thucydides' words, nobody ever learned in what way each of them perished. Thucydides was not a careless reporter. The fact that he could not determine the method of killing 2,000 people who had just been publicly paraded through Sparta tells you something specific about how the institution operated. Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus provides the operational description of young men sent out at night to kill. Aristotle's Politics describes Spartan treatment of the Helots as a wound that never healed. Here is what makes the Cryptia categorically different from every other erasure in this list. The absence of Spartan documentation was not the result of fires, conquests, political transitions, or targeted suppression by a hostile power. It was the result of a policy. Plutarch explicitly records that the Spartan lawgiver Lycurgus prohibited the writing of laws on the philosophical principle that a living constitution of trained citizens was superior to a written code. This was not illiteracy. Spartans could write. We have Spartan financial receipts, military dispatches, and diplomatic correspondence. They chose not to document their governance, and that choice had a specific legal consequence. It made every institution of the Spartan state impossible to cite as precedent, impossible to challenge in court, and impossible to investigate from the outside. Historian Paul Cartledge of Cambridge University has called Sparta's textual self-erasure the most successful act of political opacity in Greek history. Some researchers, including Noel Robertson, have argued that the Cryptia's annual declaration of war on the Helots was a legal mechanism engineered specifically to prevent documentation from accumulating. If the killing was warfare and warfare generates no individual judicial records, then the entire operation produces nothing that could be used against anyone. No sentencing documents, no victim registers, no authorization chains. The institution was self-erasing by design. It did not suppress its records afterward. It was structured to require none. The question that nobody has satisfactorily answered is the scale. Thucydides describes the disappearance of 2,000 people in a single episode and admits he cannot determine the method. Across the roughly 300 years the Cryptium operated in anything like its documented form, from the height of Spartan power in the 6th century BCE to the decline after their defeat at Leuctra in 371 BCE, the demographic arithmetic becomes genuinely staggering. Richard Catling's excavations near Sparta across the 1970s and 90s found votive deposits, but zero administrative or judicial records from the classical period, confirming that the archaeological silence matches the documentary silence completely. Some researchers ask whether the Spartan system represents not a cultural eccentricity, but the most philosophically coherent solution ever devised to the problem of state accountability. If you genuinely never write it down, there is nothing to find. No archive to burn, no tablet to smash, no records to seal. The cover-up is structural rather than reactive. The crime, if that is what it was, is committed in the absolute silence of a state that understood, perhaps better than any other in ancient history, that the most dangerous thing a government can do is leave a paper trail. Top 10. Qin Shi Huang's Purged Execution Record. From Sparta's intentional silence, we move to the last civilization on this list, one that tried something different. It created enormous quantities of records and then burned them. And the man who ordered the burning is now considered the father of a nation. Qin Shi Huang's Purged Execution Record. In 213 BCE, the first emperor of China ordered every book in the empire burned. Every history, every collection of poetry, every work of philosophy, every text that could be used to invoke historical precedent as a weapon against the present government. Chancellor Li Si formalized the edict. All books held in private hands were to be surrendered and incinerated. Those who quoted the old text to criticize the present were to be executed. Scholars who discussed the forbidden books were to be killed and their bodies displayed in public. The following year, an estimated 460 scholars were executed. Some burned alive, some buried alive in what Chinese sources call the burning of books and burying of scholars. This is one of the most documented acts of cultural destruction in ancient history. Qin Shi Huang, who unified China, standardized its currency, built the first version of the Great Wall, and whose name is embedded in the word China itself, is also the man who did this. And historians have spent centuries debating why. The standard answer is legalist philosophy. The Qin state was organized around the ideas of the legalist school, which held that strong central authority required the elimination of competing intellectual frameworks. History was a library of arguments against the government. Burn the library, remove the arguments. It is a coherent political logic, brutal in its clarity, and it is probably part of the truth. But there is another dimension that has received less attention. The Shui Hudi bamboo texts, a cache of Qin legal documents discovered in a tomb in Hubei province in 1975, represent the most complete surviving sample of the Qin legal code. They date to 217 BCE and were buried with a local magistrate. They contain extraordinarily detailed punishment schedules for over 200 categories of offense, with specific penalties, procedural requirements, and appeals processes. Historian Robin Yates of McGill University has noted that this remarkable code is entirely silent on one category of crime: treason and political offense. For the category of punishment most relevant to a government that had just unified a continent by force and was facing constant challenges to its legitimacy, the Shui Hudi texts contained nothing. Not reduced detail, not simplified procedure, nothing. Sima Qian's records of the Grand Historian, the Shiji, written around 91 BCE, approximately 120 years after these events, describes execution methods used against Qin Shi Huang's political enemies that go well beyond the standardized penalties of the surviving legal code. Sima Qian was himself a survivor of imperial judicial torture, castrated by order of Emperor Wu for the offense of defending a disgraced general. He was a historian with direct personal knowledge of what imperial punishment felt like and direct institutional memory of what records it produced. He described what happened to the emperor's enemies from the testimony of people who had witnessed it within living memory. But he was working from recalled testimony, not from the original judicial documents, because those documents, if they ever existed in the form of functioning legal code would require, are not in the surviving archive. In 2011, Chinese archaeologists identified mass grave deposits adjacent to the Qin Palace complex at Shenyang, the imperial capital. A preliminary report in the journal Wenwu Cultural Relics described hundreds of skeletal remains with evidence of perimortem trauma. The full osteological analysis has not been published. The site falls within the protected zone surrounding the Imperial Mausoleum complex, the same protected area that contains the Terracotta Army, and excavation restrictions have prevented systematic analysis for over a decade. Archaeologist Duan Qingbo has noted that Pit 3 of the Terracotta Army Complex, the smallest of the three main pits and long interpreted as a command center, contains fragmented figures with deliberately broken weapons and evidence of internal destruction before burial, possibly reflecting a crisis within the Qin court that was never formally recorded. Gideon Shalak Lavai of Hebrew University has argued that the Qin state's administrative sophistication makes the absence of judicial execution records for the political category not an accident of archival loss, but a feature of the legal architecture, the emperor's personal punishments defined as existing outside the written law. The book burning of 213 BCE destroyed the historical record that would have allowed anyone to challenge imperial governance by citing what came before. Some researchers ask whether it also destroyed something more specific, the documentation of what had already been done to the people who had tried. The mass graves are confirmed. The full analysis is not published. The archive of the most powerful empire in ancient Chinese history contains a systematic gap at precisely the point where its most extreme acts would appear. And the protected status of the site that might answer some of these questions has been in place uninterrupted for over 40 years. 10 civilizations, 10 different languages, legal systems, gods, and continents, and the same thing happens in every single one. Something extreme is done, something that works, something that serves a function the state needs, and then the record is adjusted. The Persian Empire files no judicial execution records for its most notorious method. The Assyrians carve it into palace walls and remove the tablet that explains what the walls mean. The Maya burn the books before anyone can ask the follow-up questions. Sparta never writes anything down to start with. Rome seals the door and lets the archive go quiet. Qin Shi Huang burns the history and leaves the graves unexamined. The method of erasure changes every time. The logic behind it never does. The mainstream position on most of these gaps is that they are accidents. Fires happen. Materials degrade. Bureaucracies lose things. Dynasties end and archives scatter. All of that is true, and some percentage of what is missing because of ordinary entropy rather than deliberate intent. But the gaps in this list do not cluster randomly. They cluster around exactly the categories of state action that would be most legally and politically inconvenient. Extrajudicial killing, ritual execution, the methods used specifically against political enemies, the practices a successor government would prefer to have no legal precedent for. Accidents do not cluster that way. Decisions do. What you are actually looking at across these 10 items is the archaeology of official denial. Every state in human history has had things it did that it preferred not to document. What is remarkable here is not that the practices existed. It is that the act of erasure itself survived. The missing tablet tells you a tablet existed. The unexcavated grave tells you something is in the ground. The bones that contradict the official story were put there by people who did not expect anyone to eventually read their chemistry. The cover-up outlasted the cover-up. The truth is still in the ground, still in the archive, still under the city, waiting, as it has been for 2,000 years, for someone to ask the right question. Most people walk past these things. They read the museum placard, accept the textbook explanation, and move on. You are still here because you understand that a gap in the record is not the end of the question. It is the beginning of the real one. That instinct, the refusal to let a silence just be a silence, is what actually separates the people who receive history from the people who interrogate it. If these stories of buried truths and official silences have changed how you view the history books, subscribe to our channel. We are excavating the past that empires tried to incinerate. Join the investigation. The next vault of secrets will be open soon. Like and subscribe to keep the record alive. History is not just what was written down. It is what was buried, and we are here to dig it up. See you in the next discovery.